On signing the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, into law on October 25, 1994, President Clinton said, and I quote, "After several years of intense efforts, manufacturers, experts in nutrition, and legislators, acting in a conscientious alliance with consumers at the grassroots level, have moved successfully to bring common sense to the treatment of dietary supplements under regulation and law." Now, the industry was valued at about $4 billion back then, with about 4,000 products on the market. Today, it's between $40 and $50 billion, and there are upwards of 80,000 products around. While the world has changed significantly over the last 2.5 decades, the regulations underlying dietary supplements have endured, with a few key amendments. Now, over the course of the next hour, we are going to take a deep dive into DSHEA. We're going to go on a little trip down memory lane. We're going to look at how the industry has evolved over the last 25 years, and then we're going to talk about what comes next. And who better to lead us on this little trip than two of the key architects of the actual law? I am very pleased to be joined by Loren Israelsen, who is president of the United Natural Products Alliance, and Scott Bass, who is a partner at Sidley Austin.
As Scott said earlier, and I fully agree, is that we have an opportunity with the current commissioner, who I believe has both understood the lessons of the past, and he brings a very different view and a very different temperament to this discussion that we will be having. And that is a very encouraging sign, and that the leadership at the Office of Dietary Supplements at FDA likewise has shown, I would say, not only a spirit of cooperation, but a sincere interest to continue to allow broad consumer access, but to carry out their mandate, which is the point they're making.
I agree with that. It's a total different attitude.
And that will be all the difference if we end up back in Congress, if we all conclude that there is a pathway to look at. And that we'll get to that, I'm sure, in the conversation about what will that look like as we reflect on.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to talk about some of the various provisions in DSHEA, and so we're kind of moving on now into that intermediate period. Let's look at the last 25 years. So GMPs, they were part of DSHEA, and they came in 2007, 2010?
No, 2004.
2004.
So the first reg was 4, but I think the final reg didn't come into effect until 2010.
What happened, though, to my shock, by the way,
right?
That's right, there was a phase-in.
I can never divulge my source, but I'm a GMP lawyer in part. I've done a lot of civil and criminal GMP, and I couldn't understand for the life of me why for 10 years nothing happened until somebody told me in the government that it was the intent of some people very high up in HHS to allow consumers to lose confidence in the industry, because if GMPs came into effect, it would be a quality leveler, and therefore the government would be better off having no GMPs. And that was the courageous act, really, of the then FDA Chief Counsel, Dan Troy, who said, that's enough. The statute says have GMPs, we're going to have GMPs. And the first draft that came out, I think you remember, was 1,000 pages, and it was basically drug GMPs, a little part in the middle cut out on validation. And what it ultimately evolved into is something that we've begged the agency to do more enforcement, but there are budgetary limitations.
Yeah. I have not personally witnessed that, which is disappointing. But in the context of just think about the post-DSHEA period where FDA was shell-shocked. Literally shell-shocked. They couldn't believe the bill passed. Recall that there was a repudiation of FDA that was explicitly written into the congressional record and the report of FDA's abuses, and that a provision changed the burden of proof onto FDA in any litigation. Highly unusual, to my knowledge, unprecedented. That was the level of congressional rebuke. Understandably, FDA took that quite personally, and that there were a lot of people there that had been badly stung by how this all turned out. That took time to rectify that internally at FDA, and again, I think we both appreciate, with that fairly wide lens of looking back and dealing with a number of commissioners over the years, this is the best commissioner that I have seen at FDA.
I would
close to
agree
40
with
years.
that, both from my pharmaceutical and medical device areas too. I think he's the finest commissioner in my practice, and his chief of staff is somebody who's extremely articulate, understands these areas in depth. And the head of office dietary supplements, the leadership there, as Loren said, is very interested in the dialogue. So I think we're in a different position. You know, the other thing you should know, you asked about GMP, the other thing that's key relates to the 2007, I guess it was passed in 06, adverse event law, because what people don't realize is FDA made a conscious decision, to Loren's point. In August of '96, there was a famous hearing on ephedra, at which FDA basically announced to the press, which is why you have the bad press to this day, that the Dietary Supplement Act tied FDA's hands behind their back and there's nothing they can do about it, which of course is explicitly opposite of what we wrote in. We gave them emergency powers. But having said that, the press from that day on used that same line to this day, saying it's unregulated. And they had 900 adverse events reports on ephedra. Nobody knew at that time that they were garbage. FDA could have gone into court in 1 week, had an injunction against ephedra forever. But instead, they chose to go to the press and say, we have no power to do anything. And that was, I think, the turning point.
Yeah, I agree. Ephedra was a pimple on the face of the industry that I lament personally.
Yeah. So I wanted to actually talk about ephedra very, very quickly, because DSHEA established two entities, right? One was the Office of Dietary Supplements at NIH.
Correct.
And then the other was this Commission on Dietary Supplement Labels, this very
Correct.
short-lived commission, which
Correct.
produced a report which was then sent to various people in government. And in that, they actually write, the Commission urges FDA to use its authority under DSHEA to take swift enforcement action to address potential safety issues such as those posed recently by products containing ephedrine alkaloids. So that's in 1997. They're saying we need to do something, and it was 2002, 2003 before.
Dan Troy again issued a regulation.
Yeah. It was unfortunate that FDA did not use the authority that was granted to deal with that. In retrospect, I think all parties would concur.
Yep. Okay, well let's kind of move on to now then. So the industry, has it evolved the way back in 2005? I mean, you could never have known. The internet, you had no kind of understanding of how the internet would affect dietary supplements when you wrote the law. And so
No.
how was that kind of got ahead of itself? And
That's a great question. It's a little difficult to be objective because you've seen this grow up every day. So it's all familiar, all of the changes in evolution, but if you were to step back from then to now, it would be astonishing. First, just in terms of the sheer size and magnitude. And you can judge that by going to big shows, Expo West as an example, other events. The second part is who you see, that there's a whole lot more suits and ties than we used to see. And there's a great deal of money that's very interested to participate in the industry. The personality has changed quite a lot. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that those who own the industry have their own personal and corporate and financial objectives. This has always been an industry that has been based on a sense of the commons and community, and that means that you invest at least as much, if not a bit more, than you receive from it. That would be my greatest concern, is that the desire to contribute to the community is not what it was. And more we hear people ask, who are we? We are them, the them being those that we were dealing with 25 years ago, big food, big pharma. And big food, big pharma are extremely interested in what we have to offer, as are the consumers for all of us. That would be my biggest concern, is can we maintain our integrity as I would say a philosophy, an approach to life and health. Is there the political will and the expertise resident in the industry today to engage in what looks to be a relook at DSHEA The head count is low, not without significance that Senator Hatch is retired. Chairman Dingell passed away very recently. There are no remaining members of Congress that were directly involved in DSHEA. That's now over. There are no staffers, to my knowledge, as well. So the DNA strand has run out to some degree. And now with a highly divided and bipartisan, a partisan Congress, the prospect of trying to get something meaningful done is an exhausting thought.
So the kind of the path of optimism is through Gottlieb and some of the things that he's talking
partially,
about.
I would say engagement through Gottlieb and through Office of Dietary Supplements. But I share Loren's fundamental concern very much, but my view is that I think it's now a combination. I gave up on the people who had a cause and built companies around the cause, because there are only a few of those left. Loren and I are still extremely active and taking leadership positions to keep people from misbehaving, essentially, as well as trying to move innovation forward. But I'm not bothered by the fact that you have large, responsible companies who are willing to invest money if they see there's a reason to in safety studies or substantiation and globalizing. And it's my view, the reason I'm optimistic is I think I take from Commissioner Gottlieb's statement this week a recognition and agreement that we're not going to have a dietary supplement industry 10 years from now. We're going to have what people have been talking about, which is a functional food industry. Medical foods, which are regulated by FDA with a 30-year out-of-date scheme that has nothing to do with the market or the science that's emerging. Intellectual property and exclusivity on the table, which I think FDA would be willing to listen to, are proposals to create exclusivities or some incentives for companies to invest. We've put forth a proposal that if a company spends a lot of money on safety, FDA can't allow another company on until they do an equal quality safety, what we call a de facto exclusivity. So there are a lot of ways to move this, and I actually think as long as you have Loren around and certain other people who care, because the company people aren't there for the most part, I think we can fashion something good, and if it is, I think there are a lot of responsible companies, say in the OTC industry, who would want to invest and are investing. But the interesting thing is what I don't find tolerable is the vestigial concerns of people who are hiding behind things like we don't trust FDA, so we don't want to grow up, when really all they're trying to do is eke out some more income with low-grade products or poor quality. And that part, I think both of us share that view. We've talked about this. You know, it's one thing to legitimately to be a small business person who needs a little easier go in order to make it. It's a different thing to be a company in business for a long time that doesn't want to spend the money to upgrade, and that's what a lot of the opposition is now to growing up.
I mean, you and I have talked about this. Like, there's a lot of people making a lot of money in this industry. I mean, it's a very profitable industry, right? And when DSHEA, those early seeds or sparks for DSHEA, there was clear moments where you're like, this is where the movement started. Whereas today, there doesn't feel like that. There's not that kind of inflection point or that crisis that would spark this. Well, let's take this and do something.
That's true. Yeah, that's the sense of urgency doesn't exist for sure. The sense of opportunity might be the working equivalent today. Is that those that say, why can't we, and then fill in the blanks, say more about our products or this or that. There's a voice that still wishes that there was a traditional medicines category. Mm-hmm. That should be listened to. The big one that's on the table is how do we integrate dietary supplements and our industry's views? And I would extend that now to medical foods or their equivalents, functional foods of all sorts. How does that really fit into the broader healthcare system?
That's right.
That is the trillion-dollar question. And the opposition ultimately will be one that we have to deal with, is that to get into that system, we have to make some big compromises. That is a debate that we need to have. To me, that is the fundamental go-forward issue for a DSHEA.
In fact, Loren, I think that's the inflection point that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that the failure of every major health care system in the world, and it is in the world, is what's driving the $40 billion market, because people, A, don't want to go to a hospital, and B, can't afford to, so they'll do everything they can to prevent disease or to maintain their health, even if they have a condition, by taking a product. It may not be a dietary supplement, it could be a medical food or FSDU, but it's something.
Yeah.
A faux shoe product,
Yeah.
you know, a traditional medicine.
Yeah. This is the eternal river that flows through everyone that really has this understanding of natural health and wellness, is that we're responsible individually. So what are the tools to do that? Well, it was the framework of DSHEA. It's access to what I think is valuable, useful information, high quality standards, a light touch by the regulators to step in when clearly there's misbehavior, and then let people educate themselves and make choices. They won't always be the best decision, but our fundamental view going is it is not the government's responsibility to make sure everybody makes a good decision.
But it is the responsibility of the industry to have a baseline of safety and substantiation, which they're
Correct.
not meeting
Correct.
in large part.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the low barrier to entry, because this is obviously a criticism that's leveled pretty often at the industry. It's far too easy to go out there, find a contract manufacturer, whack some, you know, do a formulation, whack your own label on it, put it on the internet, off you go. And in theory, like, the inspection authority was supposed to address that, facilities registration, NDI notification.
Stop right there.
Okay.
That's the problem. You just put your finger. The problem is the NDI system is not working because of what Loren said. The way it was written is a mess, but also we need a mandatory listing so FDA knows what's on the market, so they know it has to be registered. You cannot go to a contract manufacturer, slap your label on. You need to notify FDA, and FDA has to know what's in there and what the claim is. That isn't happening now. What is it, 1% of companies are filing NDIs who should?
It's a low number.
I mean, it's ridiculous, and that's the part of the system that needs the biggest fix.
But then that's also going back to 1994, right? Because, you know, we didn't establish a list of grandfathered ingredients, so we don't. I mean, there are lists from that time,
Right.
but none of them are officially recognized.
Right.
Now FDA is kind of scrambling, kind of, to maybe.
You know what?
one.
That's, to me, I know a lot of people care about that, but no, I mean
It's a side
mandatory
issue.
listing, meaning let's step up and say, okay, we're proud to be on the market. I mean, just think of the concept. You go into the market, you're selling products to consumers on the internet or in the store, and yet you're not willing to tell anybody you're on the market officially. I mean, it just makes no sense.
Yeah, and this will clearly be one of the go-forward discussions. Things such as mandatory registration of product and facility. That is a global standard, basically, almost in every other country. That provision operates in some way. The U.S. is an exception to that. The consumers' expectations have evolved and changed, and that would not, I think,
That's a
be
good point.
welcomed
Yeah.
by consumers. That will be one of those test issues, is have we evolved to a point now where that can be a thoughtful discussion about, okay, how would that work? And that needs to be had, that discussion. But there's a number of things, and I think right now what is fun to think about is, if we're really going to put a table out and invite people to sit there and say, what do you think? We better come prepared with some very clear and specific ideas of what we think the future should look like in terms of a statutory framework. I'll be intrigued to see, you know, to what degree that the industry reveals its populist side in that, which will be there. It is always there, more quiet than at other times. To see if there's a new generation of leaders that will arise because there's an opportunity now to be a leader in a new way is, you know, is the old, I guess it's an old saying of some sort, is that sergeants, colonels, and generals are made on the battlefield. And that will be true here, is that as we look at that legacy group of players that worked so hard together on DSHEA and have remained close friends ever since, is I don't think that the wartime buddy analogy is inappropriate, is that was a brutal 2.5 years. And on the back end of it, it looks like it must have been pretty easy, because here we got the finished tidy statute, and there it is. But boy, oh boy, to get from the beginnings of the whole idea, which were laughed at, I mean, openly laughed at by most everybody in Washington, and they just thought, you know, how long is this going to last? In fact, I will digress. The bill was introduced, the original Health Freedom Act in 1992 was introduced in June. There was an FDLI conference in Virginia, just right over the river, and I was at one round table at this big luncheon, and the deputy commissioner was at another, and a guy ran in and whispered in his ear, and I just happened to hear, Senator Hatch has introduced a bill, dietary supplement bill. There was a short pause, and he said, don't worry, it's not going to go anywhere. And it was that dismissive sense of, all right, you know, here it is. None of us could have predicted, you know, where this would have gone. Either the passage of the bill, which itself was a Hail Mary, or that 10 times growth over 25 years, which I think you can directly attribute to a foundation that was solid enough that you can now build some pretty big buildings on it in the form of investments. And it's great that this is being done, is that there has not been a chance for Scott and I to sit down and think about these things for quite a long time. I have a pretty clear idea, though, that we will be once again as we move into this next phase.
Yeah. Now, Scott, I mean, you said a couple of times during this past hour or so that the industry hasn't grown up. But would you say, it is growing up, right? I mean, there's things that happened over the last 5, 8 years, from whether it's Eric Schneiderman in New York and everything that happened from that. There are conversations, in my opinion, there are conversations that are now happening in the public sphere that wouldn't have happened, and things that are being considered that wouldn't have been considered maybe 5 years ago because of the extra scrutiny that the industry's been
You know,
doing.
I agree with that in part. Okay. Schneiderman, to me, is a one-off. That was a publicity stunt using a DNA test used for dinosaur bones that had nothing to do with herbs. So I don't consider that.
Totally agree.
But I get your point. Your point is that with all the I don't think the scrutiny actually is as bad as it was in the 90s. I actually think it was worse back then. Everything was held up. No, I think there are some people, Loren and I speak to each other, and it's amazing. We're exactly in the same place on every issue, even if he won't admit it. And, but, you know, the point is that we're impatient. We're impatient because, you know what, let's take this master listing thing, since that's the hot issue right now. I was shocked to see how many people said, well, I'm not sure, FDA might regulate too much. I mean, just think about the fact that you have $40 billion worth of product, and there are companies saying, I'm not sure I want the government to know I'm selling it. You're willing to sell it to consumers, but you're not willing to list it with the government, so they can go after companies that haven't filed NDIs, that are putting tainted ingredients in and giving us all a bad name. It's just, and I think also the investment side, and that's where I said with Loren, I'm very optimistic, because when you have players like established companies in the OTC drug field, for example, that recognize globally that nutritionals are a large part of the future, they'll spend the time and money to check out a claim, to have some safety tests, and that's not a bad thing. So for the core people for whom, as Loren said, it's still a cause before it's a business, and you know, we admire those people. The fact is, if you have people who are willing to make the rest grow up, I don't think that's anything but positive. And also the government, as Loren said, is now in a position where they're saying, okay, there are a lot of abuses, but we understand the regulatory scheme is now something that may not address, I like the way you put it, the consumer expectations have grown with the market, and I think that's a good point. So I don't think that Schneiderman or a couple of these publicity areas have themselves forced people to grow up. In fact, on the contrary, I still see defensive attitudes. I think it's more just some of the things Loren was reverting to, the additional investment, the globalization, the fact that all of the countries have a scheme where you have to register products, and also that there is a need to expand the category beyond vitamin, mineral, and herb pills to a much broader health paradigm that Loren was referring to that would require a different type of science.
Okay, so I want to kind of like tie it up now because we're into the last couple of minutes. So looking at the industry as of right now, what keeps you up at night when you think about, you know, this law that you both wrote, basically? And then what if you could have one thing or two things that you would add to make this so much better, to take this industry to the next step? Yeah. What would they be?
Two things keep me up. One of them is the incident where industries all around us, in produce and foods, you see E. coli contaminations, things of this sort. We have had remarkably few such incidents over the years. That concerns me, is that it happens, and it could easily happen to us. Vigilance on the quality compliance is paramount. If that happens, that we will lose an enormous amount of trust and confidence at the consumer level. The other one is CBD and hemp extracts, is what becomes of that. That these are two worlds that are very quickly moving. One is moving much faster toward us than we toward them. That is going to be a very interesting, complicated development to deal with. I suspect that it will end up being put on the table as part of a DSHEA 2.0, if we use that term. That we have to think through how that would work, if it would work. But honestly, it's just an event that really damages the industry as a whole and provokes Congress, who was otherwise distracted, to take a look. And that's not a great way to open a discussion about where we'd like to see things going forward.
Scott?
I think the number one thing that keeps me up is stagnation. This idea that I was mentioning in the context of the industry not being willing to grow up. You have FDA coming out with an announcement that we applaud, but why is it that industry didn't come out with those proposals 5 years ago for self-regulatory help? As Loren said, one of the premises of the DSHEA is we want to treat consumers as smart people who can figure out what's real and what's not real. Our only obligation is to deliver safe products, responsible claims, and to innovate. That's a big ticket, but nonetheless, we're innovating in part, but we're not doing enough to establish that confidence. So I guess it's not one thing, but that is the number one thing that bothers me. And I think the solutions, you asked what two things, as I mentioned, one is a mandatory listing, and the other is recognizing that we're in a much larger health paradigm and it's not just about supplements.
Wonderful. Scott, Loren, I'm so glad we were able to make this happen. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So look out for more coverage of DSHEA coming up on NutraIngredients-USA. I've been your host, Stephen Daniels. Thanks for listening.